Is my mic on? Oh, it is. And then the stream will turn on. It's really dark up there, so she's making hand signals, and I can tell something moved, but I'm not really sure what the hand signal was. It could be. I don't know. So we'll start with the homework assignment. No, just kidding. I like saying that because I can just feel people's blood pressure going when you say those words. So what we planned to do was everybody got either the electronic version or the physical version of this book, and we were reading the section on the Dharma ideas that we presented in the first class, and then it's a little odd, but my training in college was in a school where the books and what the lectures were not closely related. They were supportive. So it would help you understand the lecture if you'd read the book, but it wasn't like, question number 4 on the quiz was from section number 4 in the book. I didn't go to school like that. So my favorite English teacher, extremely old-timer, and we would joke that he was at the school I went to when Longfellow went to the school I went to, but that's not probably true. Anyway, he would just come in and say, well, what have you been reading in the Poe? And so there was no, if somebody said, oh, I just read the ringing and the dinging of the bells, and he's, oh, the bells, and he would talk about that. And if somebody else said, I don't know, it's Billy Budd's not Poe, that's Emerson. Anyway, Melville, Billy Budd. Okay, somebody's nodding. If somebody said that, then he'd go off that direction, and that was where we went. So I am more organized than that, but in the reading, did anyone find a part or section or something that worth putting a Post-it in and talking about or asking about? I see a hand here. Remind me of your name. Sawyer. Okay. Well, we'll start with one, and then we could bounce around a little bit. Okay. So which one did you find? Okay.
It's a big question that I bounce around to a lot of people, and it was the belief that things don't happen independently.
Right.
It's a cause and effect. Everything is kind of like a big giant domino effect.
It's like a multi-dimensional domino effect, because one domino doesn't fall until a lot of other things, like even dominoes. Somebody made the domino, right? So that's part of the domino falling. And gravity is part of the domino falling. So you have to have a planet, or domino's not that interesting in space. A bunch of dominoes just sit there, floating. So there's a lot to it. But then someone has to conceptualize what a domino is. So what page are you going to point out to us?
My note is on page 45.
Okay. And we were sort of reading 38 to 75. But I mean, you're welcome to. Books are fun because there's a whole universe there, and you can just kind of go wherever it takes you. So what?
I think it was the most interesting in paragraph 3.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of the idea that things happen chronologically, so there really isn't anything you can do about it. And I thought that was really interesting. Because I personally, I don't know, this sounds a very scary idea, but I personally don't believe in like a concept of free will.
Uh-huh.
And so I think that's really interesting that like I was reminded of my own theories within the book.
So paragraph 3 is, if all has been decided by destiny, both good deeds and evil deeds are predetermined, weal and woe are predestined, nothing would exist that has not been foreordained, then all human plans and efforts for improvements and progress would be in vain, and humanity would be without hope. I'm not sure that paragraph is actually saying what the Buddha thought. I'd have to read like a lot more. So it's interesting because Buddhism is a middle way, and we have lots of middles. Middles are very unsatisfying because if you're extremely this way or extremely that way, as we know from politics, it's easy to get excited. If you kind of feel like, I can see that side and I can see that side, it's much less dramatic. So with this too, we have a middle way view. Preordination suggests a sky, Father, Earth, Mother deciding what's going to happen to you. We don't have that. Instead, we see that all these causes and conditions, like I was saying about the domino, flow together into a moment to determine what happens. So Dr. Matsunaga, I'm pointing to him, used to say, you think you walked through the door today because you decided to, but you didn't really decide to. Really, all the threads of everything and experience in your life came together. You've driven by 999 times, and this is the 1000th time. And in that moment, you have time, you have the inclination, you're driving the car. That sounds very personal. Buddhism, Buddhism is interesting to you. You've experienced that, but those threads flow from a lot of different places. And all those things come together into you walking through the door. There is an element of free will-ish, but it is just one of many causes. So that makes it a middle way thing and not an extreme, there's a cosmic puppeteer just making everybody do everything, which is kind of an unsatisfying view. And then another kind of unsatisfying view is that you decide everything and you control everything. This results in people with egos the size of houses, which may actually be kind of the dominant view of most Americans, is that they decide everything. And if they drive a car to New York, it's because they make the road, they invent the car. I mean, there's an awful lot of causes and conditions you have to ignore to think that your free will is the thing that decides everything. So Buddhism in the middle, it says that there are many other causes and conditions. Your will and thought and the ability to judge what is wholesome or skillful is part of it, but it's just one part of it. Maybe that would be my response to you picking that one paragraph out.
I agree. Picking one paragraph is definitely not reflective of the whole idea. So I probably should have specified that. I just thought that.
That's okay. Right. The Buddha had, it's strange, but 2,600 years ago, most of the ideas you've heard of were there too. And at the time, there were a lot of different schools of spiritual life and philosophy. So things like universities didn't quite exist, so there were things called ashrams, which were specific schools for specific religious viewpoints, and you would come together at that place and learn about it. He'd gone to 6 different ashrams when he was studying before his enlightenment. So the views, there were materialists who thought everything was just stuff, and then death that was it. There was no anything else. There was no spiritual universe. And then there were schools that thought everything was actually spiritual and this materiality was just a confused delusion on your part. In fact, there was really nothing. And those two were big extremes. The Buddha kind of lands in the middle. Physical stuff exists, sure, but there's more to everything than just that. So we're kind of in the middle with that. Okay, let's pick another, yes. What was your name?
Like through the first,
Morgan?
Yeah, it seems through the first reading, the word, I'd like to dive into the word conditions, because it seems like there's like human condition, environmental conditions, like the way it's used in the reading. So,
Right.
So is that how it's used as malleable towards the human being and consciousness and the environment? It seems
So that's interesting. The word condition, the human conditioned existence we'll talk about. And what is it conditioned by? It's like when we use the word emptiness. Well, empty of what? There is sort of an implication that there's something else that you're talking about when you talk about conditioning. Everything in this saha world, saha kind of means messy, is conditioned by our selfish self's view. So the unconditioned is actually a name for the Buddha, who is someone who is free. If you can't quite hear, I'll speak up, but this is bringing fresh air in the room, and it's supposed to be good if you have lots of people in the room to bring fresh air in, so we set it up. Anyway, so conditioned reality, we'll use that phrase a lot in Buddhism, and that refers to reality seen through the eyes of selfishness. And selfishness really in a very broad sense. Even the idea that I am separate from everything else is, the Buddha would say, a delusion. Because just like the domino, if the domino thinks it decides to be here and then it decides to fall, it's just patently silly. So many other causes and conditions have to be present for the domino to fall. We're the domino, but we pretty strongly believe we decide everything. You know, I decided I was going to have the pomodoro pasta last night. Well, did you really decide, or aren't there a lot of other experiences that flowed into that moment? You know, the restaurant put it on the menu, so you did choose it from a limited number of options. So there's an element of your own choice in there. The conditioning is really the idea that things are separate, and then we have this urge to thirst, to cling to things, and that causes suffering. That's the fundamental condition. So in his part of the universe, that delusion doesn't exist. Causes and conditions that flow into things happening, sure, those exist. But the important thing is to let go of is that delusion. And everybody thinks, well, if you let go of the delusion of I'm, me, my, and self, you'd be crazy, right? No. Turns out life is much more pleasant. Interacting with other human beings is much more pleasant. It's not a problem. It's actually the solution to the problem is I, me, my thinking. So that's my response to asking about condition. Okay, we have time for one more that someone brought. Okay. Remind me of your name. Steve. Okay. Right, the parable of the raft. So the river, or the body of water, in Buddhism, this shore, conditioned reality, is this shore. The other shore is enlightenment, Buddhahood, being free of all the things that encumber us. And the thing that gets us to the other shore is a clear, organized understanding of the Dharma, which is like a raft. It's kind of woven together out of sticks. If each idea in Buddhism is a stick, you could imagine you'd make a raft. Well, most people don't make rafts out of sticks, but you know that Moses thing, they had wasn't it like a raft? It looks like a basket. I'm thinking of the Gospel according to Cecil B. DeMille, but in the movies it looked like a bunch of sticks. So you fashion that raft. So in this parable, the last thing you let go of is the raft, which makes it pretty interesting. That means the Buddha isn't a Buddhist. Buddhism is the raft. Once you're enlightened, you don't need it anymore. And then there's a thing called spiritual materialism. A couple different important books and Dharma books have talked about this, but it exists in all religions, where instead of opening yourself to enlightenment, people get all wrapped around the rules. The idea of the rules is to get you to the other shore, and the Buddha is saying that explicitly. That's what's important. There was a famous story. I generally don't talk about Christian saints, but Francis, I think, is kind of interesting. They had trouble with Francis because he would always give everything away. I mean, they would dress him he would go out into the town and come back naked because he'd given someone else his robe. And then, Francis, you can't keep doing this, you know. But he was, you know, a very, how do we say, spiritually tuned in kind of person. And the generosity and love of just simply, I have it, you need it here, was his nature. And everybody else said, no, you have to be in your uniform. So they're thinking about the rules more than, obviously, it is sort of a problem. We have to have a middle way approach to that sort of thing. And give and help others, sure, but you can't give away your food and then you're starving, then now what, somebody else has to save you. That doesn't quite make sense. It's a middle way question. So the raft is Buddhism, and we have to remember to let it go. So all of Buddhism is teaching different ways to let go of stuff, let go of preconceived ideas, and then ultimately we let go of Buddhism. Thank you. Okay, I think that was page, did you say 54?
Yeah.
Okay, 54 through a little bit. Okay, that's all we have time for in the reading. But next time's reading is going to be about the life of the Buddha. You know, it's kooky because it's the first pages, the front part of the book, and I asked you to read the second part first, but that means at least I thought about it. When I say the Buddha, in the larger sutra on the Pure Land, they talk about Buddhas as many as the grains of sand in the Ganges River. That's a lot. But usually we're taught about Buddha as though it was one person, and a person 2,600 years ago. But there are just many other Buddhas, and enlightenment is completely possible among sentient beings anywhere in the universe. Once you recognize that this crux of suffering comes from clinging to the I, me, myself, and you realize a way of letting that go, then enlightenment occurs. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what you're studying. It doesn't matter how many legs you have. None of those things matter. It's an inherent quality of sentient beings to have enlightenment. When we bow to each other, we're bowing to the Buddha nature in the other person. So the person could be a rat. We'd still bow to them because we're not judging them, and we know deep inside there is that spark, a Mani jewel, it's sometimes referred to. There's a jewel inside of everyone. And, you know, we all experience that in others, and we also experience them doing other stuff, so for selfish reasons. So we're going to talk about the life of the Buddha today. And we did the reading, so I planned that. Okay, who was the Buddha? So, pop quiz. How many of these are actual Buddhas? One answer was all of them. Another answer might be none. Okay, those are the two extremes. So, this is a statue of Shakyamuni Buddha, crafted in Afghanistan, when Afghanistan was like super hotbed of Buddhist studies, like right about the beginning of the Common Era. And then, is it gonna zoom? No, okay. And then this one is a traditional Indian representation of Shakyamuni Buddha, 2,600 years ago. And then this one is a Buddha called the Medicine Buddha. There's an altar to the Medicine Buddha over here. What is the characteristic that seems to be blue? Right. I really love this about the Medicine Buddha because the Medicine Buddha shines a blue light to heal things. What kind of light do we shine on our cell phone to sterilize it? Ultraviolet. So it's interesting that maybe it's just an accident, but anyway, the blue Buddha is the Medicine Buddha. And so these three this is the same Buddha, that's another Buddha, and then the third one is the Bodhisattva Hotai. And the Bodhisattva Hotai will, in like 5,000 years or something like that, be reborn as the Buddha Maitreya. Maitreya is loving kindness or love, in the future, here. So that's the answer to the question. The point is to kind of open your mind to the idea that there are many, many Buddhas, because I'm about to tell you the story of just this one personage. And it's easy, especially the way we get taught in school, in high school and university. Sometimes there'll be cultural classes and they'll talk about Buddhism. And they're so specific. I mean, very, very common thing they say is Shakyamuni, the prince 2,600 years ago, invented Buddhism or is the founder of Buddhism. And that's if you ask a Buddhist, I mean, I don't know why nobody ever seems to ask, but that's not the way we look at it at all, because he even said that this process of realizing what reality really is has always existed, you know. So to say he founded something in particular, he was part, you know, it's like if somebody bought a Krispy Kreme franchise. I thought if I talked about Krispy Kreme franchise, Randy wouldn't leave, but just kidding. In Portola, that they invented Krispy Kremes. Like, well, no, they didn't. The fundamental aspects of Krispy Kreme are available to us, and then one wonderfully enlightened individual will collect the necessary spiritual capital, or in the case of Krispy Kremes, it's just plain money, together to establish an experience that is the franchise. Okay, this is going too far. I should, you know how you can take an analogy too far. Okay, so those are Buddhas, and except for one was a Bodhisattva. So the life of the Buddha. Now, it is confusing because we say the Buddha, and yet I just said there were many. So when I'm talking about Shakyamuni Buddha, sometimes we will say the historical Buddha, but that's really long, the historical Buddha. So then we just, if you know what I'm talking about, we can talk about it. Obviously, Amida Buddha is another Buddha we talk about a lot in the Shin Buddhist temple, and this time we're not talking about that personage, we're talking about Shakyamuni, interestingly enough, was born in a country called Shakya. Shakyamuni actually means the sage of the Shakya people, so it's not a surprise if he was born in Lithuania, he would be called the sage of Lithuania, right? So Shakya now, the boundaries are kind of half in India, half in Nepal, and the two countries are having a little cultural dispute as to who owns the Buddha. But usually you go to Nepal to see where the Buddha was born, or to where the town he grew up in, Kapilavastu, and then you go to India to go to the places he was enlightened and taught as a Buddha. They also hold you up at the border for a long time. And when I say hold up, I think there's some payments required as well as wasting your time. Okay, so before the Buddha was born, let's think of a better word for this. Gautama was born, that's his first name. He existed in Tushita heaven, which is a heaven where highly evolved spiritual beings are reborn. And you can see the other gods. Gods, interestingly enough, have many faces in the Indian representation. So they're not locked into just one way of being. And then, after an afternoon of dalliance with the king, his mother, Mahamaya, took a nap, and she had an interesting dream. It was a dream about a six-tusked elephant. This person did not put in all the tusks, but anyway, we have paintings in the back by one of our members, and there are 6 tusks on that elephant. She had this dream that the elephant kind of entered her side, and then she was pregnant. So it's not exactly an Immaculate Conception story, but it's a little bit like that. And sometimes they gloss over the afternoon dalliance with the king part, and then it's even more miraculous. But they had been trying to get pregnant. Obviously, kings always want heirs, so that's like an important thing. in their political system. And and that hadn't happened for a while, so it was a wonderful realization that she was pregnant. When Maya came to term, strangely, it's like 10 or 11 months, which doesn't make any sense biologically, but hey, that's the way the legend goes. She felt the baby coming, and so the tradition of the time was to get in a wagon and go to your mother's house at that point. If you're a princess, then you have to go to the neighboring kingdom because you're from the way the kingdoms would interchange or whatever, create political stability was to intermarry the households. So she was halfway to her home country. It was a day and a half ride in a place called Lumbini, and she didn't make it over there before the baby was coming. So they got out of the carriage, which is in the background there, and she stood under an Ashoka tree, and she held a branch, and she gave birth to the baby in the standing position, which still exists in India. It's uncommon in America to think about that, but the legend goes that the baby was born, took 7 steps, and proclaimed that I will be a great boon to all sentient beings. So in the painting in the back, you also see the same kind of little baby-looking Buddha with his hand pointed up, and that is that proclamation that I will be a great boon to all sentient beings. We all know that babies seldom speak, so this is the more legendy part of the legend. The interesting thing is that when we were on our pilgrimage 3 years ago to India, and we went to Lumbini, and our wonderful guide on our trip was the anthropologist who was born in Lumbini and had studied there a lot, studied other places too, an ordained Buddhist priest as well. He and his team had found the stone that was that spot. And 2,600 years ago, finding a place is very, very difficult to do. Very few locations are locatable that are that old. And they dug down quite a way through the mud and dirt and whatever. But they found one stone that didn't correspond. And in the stories, the villagers, so when a prince is born, you want to mark the spot because it's some sacred, auspicious spot. The villagers took a stone, in the legend it says, they took a stone from another place and placed it there. So geologically, there's this one stone, this granite, and everything else around there is sandstone. So somebody put that there. And also it's within the proximity, a couple 100 feet of the traditional, there have been temples and monasteries built in that place, because it's where the Buddha was born. But archaeologically, to find the actual stone, the very first marker of the Buddha, is very wonderful and exciting. And so we got to see it, and that was great fun. There probably is, but I don't know it. I remember specifically that there were supposed to be 7, and there's 7 in that one too. So dig that up and share it with us. Could you? Yeah, thank you. There's 7 days in a week. That's an important 7. But it's also kind of a special number in a lot of ways. So this happened. So basically the Buddha was born in a park-like area by the side of the road when his mother was on her way back to her parents' castle. And so then they did a U-turn and came back to Kapilavastu. Suddhodana, the king, you can see he's there, the guy with the big crown on. Well, the first tragedy. 2 days after Gautama was born, his mother died. It's not an uncommon thing. 2,600 years ago, childbirth had some risks and dangers. They exist for us today, but much less so. So a lot of people, it's interesting, notice that and think, well, that's interesting. The person who focused on the pain and suffering of living is the person who lost his mother when he was 2 days old. So maybe there's some kind of interesting causal connection to that. I don't know. Psychologists probably make a lot of that. Suddhodana, as a king, wanted to know how this was going to turn out. Kings often will do that. So he called together all these soothsayers and religious fancy people and people who could see the future in psychic ways to look at the baby. And they came and they congratulated Suddhodana on having a son, because if you're king, you want the next king to be your son, and that was the way they did things, patrilineally. But then Asita, this very old gentleman there, held the baby in his arms. And when he held the baby in his arms, he started crying. Suddhodana was very worried, because if a doctor holds your baby, examines your baby and then starts crying, it seems like something tragic is going to happen soon. And so Suddhodana was frightened and angry, and as kings always are if anything doesn't work the way they want it to, and said, "What is this?" And Asita said, "Well, this is a wonderful person. This is a person that will turn the wheel of Dharma, that will end the suffering of sentient beings who are his students. It's so wonderful. And I am old. He's just a baby. I'll never see it." So he was crying because he could see the potential, spiritual potential of little Gautama, and he wouldn't live to see that moment. So Suddhodana was disturbed by another aspect of that. He would have preferred Asita to say, so Asita did, and all the consensus, let's go back to the consensus among these smart people, was that Gautama would either be a fantastic monarch, kind of an emperor kind of king, as opposed to Suddhodana, which was a king of a city-state, or be a wonderful spiritual person, one or the other. So that planted the seed in Suddhodana's mind that, that Gautama should be taught like a prince, and then he wouldn't become a spiritual person because he was taught martial arts and sword fighting and archery and all these wonderful things. And so ever had the sense sometimes that mothers and fathers have a plan for their children and their children turn out different? It's almost always. And even if they don't turn out different, then when the children are about 40, they turn that corner and realize, why am I living my life for my parents? And they go another direction. So we all know how this turned out. Suddhodana did not succeed in making his son a wonderful king. The first glimpse that, why did I say? So Siddhartha Gautama. Gautama is his last name, Siddhartha is his first name. Siddhartha had this experience underneath a rose apple tree. It was the spring festival day, the first plowing of the fields. The king is the one who plows the field the first time. And as if you've ever been with kids at an important ritual, they tend to get bored really fast. So they wander off and play games and do stuff. Siddhartha was a different kind of little boy, so he went and sat under a rose apple tree in the shade, and he was observing the first plowing of the field, and he saw the earth cut with the blade of the plow, of the worms and creatures being kind of cut in half by this and writhing in pain. He saw the little birds come down and start eating the bits of worm and all the other interesting nutrients that get turned up when you plow the field. And then as he was watching these little birds, a hawk came down and snatched one of them. Okay, he's got a snake, but still, same difference. The hawk came down and snatched, so it was sort of, Wild Kingdom, or the law of the jungle, kill and be killed and destroyed. It was disturbing to this 9-year-old, and he had insights that most people wouldn't have, certainly very few 9-year-olds would have, but even most of us wouldn't really kind of dig into that whole process the way he did, tune into it. So then he sat in the shade of a rose apple tree. Remember, later he gets enlightened under a tree, so the tree is important. And spontaneously meditated. So he just calmly reflected on that, and they say he reached the first jhana, which is a joyful, energetic state of meditation. And Suddhodana here, you can see him scowling. that damn kid's meditating again. You know, he didn't want him to do that. He wanted him to be like, you know, get a stick and fight with somebody like a king would. But Suddhodana is often disappointed in Siddhartha. So Siddhartha grows older. Suddhodana thinks, you know, we should get him married or get him interested in girls, because then all the spiritual stuff would go out the window, because that's sort of normal and natural. Siddhartha was a fine human specimen and a wonderful archer, among other things, and very similar to a certain Disney story. Suddhodana sends out the word to all the neighboring kingdoms and the locals that if you've got a beautiful daughter that you'd like to get married to the prince, now's the time, and we'll have sort of a contest thing or selection process. So here's all the pretty girls in the neighboring area, and here's Yasodhara, and Siddhartha has chosen her. I just pulled my microphone out, so hopefully I'm still broadcasting. I think I am. So Suddhodana's really happy. They get married. This will work out great, right? You ever seen a couple that is having trouble, so they decide, well, I'm skipping one thing ahead. They get married, and all these paintings, Siddhartha's a little distant. He's not really happy about things. He knows he should. So if you ever met anybody who got married because they should, it's an awkward situation. You need to be fully, completely invigorated and excited about joining with another person, then get married. If you're not sure and you're doing it because your dad said so, it almost never works out wonderfully. Suddhodana was very controlling. Got his son married. This will tie him in. But Siddhartha being locked up in the castle all the time, that never works. If you ever tried to keep children in, they get out. The more you try to keep them in, the more they try to get out. And then eventually they figure out there are windows in their room as well as doors, right? So there's no reasonable way to control youthful people. He's sort of a teenager here. This is a depiction of the 4 sights. So as the legend goes, Siddhartha was intrigued about the outside world, but always kept in this kind of separated environment of the palace. So he would sneak out. 4 times he snuck out. One time he snuck out, he saw an old person. One time he saw a sick person. One time he saw a dead person. None of these things was he allowed to see in the palace, because they figured if he showed him that, then it might kind of push him in a more spiritual direction. He might start asking big questions about life and the universe and everything. So they sheltered him from that. But being sheltered, you know, sneaking out of the palace and then seeing a funeral procession, and in India, a funeral procession is a dead body on a board with your relatives carrying you to the river to be cremated, which is for us in America, where death is not dealt with in a very open, understanding way, very shocking. I mean, they still do that, and it's still kind of a surprise when you're in India. I studied in Sri Lanka for a year, and that was the first place I really saw dead people. It's not a common occurrence, you know. Anyway, so Siddhartha, sheltered, sees these 3 sights. The 4th sight is this person here, which is a religious person, someone who has dedicated their life to spiritual matters, to study and understand. And that was a surprise to him too, because guess what? Suddhodana didn't want him to turn into a spiritual person, so he made sure he didn't have any teachers that were spiritual people. Okay. But now the handwriting's on the wall for the marriage. So, their son, Siddhartha and Yasodhara's son, was born. So I already skipped over some stuff, but you can imagine what happened. They had a big party, because when the prince has a son, that's a big, it's party time. So you see all these passed out people here. in the sutra, when Siddhartha describes this, or the Buddha later described it, you can even see like some spittle dripping out of that one's mouth. I don't know if you've ever been to a party like that. Maybe I just want to be honest and say I have been to parties like that where there were just people asleep, just kind of bleh, all over the place. He describes, and he didn't drink that much that night because it was not happening for him. He didn't see the fun of all this. He was contemplating making a big shift in his life. He describes walking through these people. He said it was like walking through corpses, and there was the fluid leaking from many orifices of the bodies as he walked through them, and it's just really kind of gruesome imagery. And in a lot of ways, going to a party and getting so drunk you pass out and drool is like death. You're not affirming life. It's not really fun. It's an escape, and escaping life by turning to death is pointless because then the next life will occur and the next life will occur. Has anybody ever seen the movie Groundhog Day? Yeah, people have seen that. It's actually quite difficult to, once you realize that there's no way out of this difficult cyclical process other than gaining greater understanding and being freed the way the Buddha was freed. When you recognize that, then just getting so drunk you don't notice the pain anymore, it isn't a solution. It's just a worse expression of the same problem. So he picks his way through the bodies and the corpses, as he said, peeks through the door at his wife and new baby son. This is... he's a wonderful, heroic person. It's now, if someone left their new family when the day of the child's birth, we would consider it a pretty lowly, immoral act, but they lived in a palace, and there's lots of other family around in the palace, and so they were going to be okay. But he's realizing he has to leave, and that's a little bit frightening, a little bit shocking, kind of strange. My brother is not a Buddhist, and he considers it just like if you found a religion on someone just abandoning their family, that's no foundation. And I hear him when he says that, and I said, well, yes, but in the grand scheme of all the everything, it was a heroic decision, a very difficult and painful decision, because selfishly, stay in the palace, eat fruit whenever you feel like it, wine, dancing girls, it's a palace, right? But he left because he couldn't take it anymore. It was almost like lying about the nature of human experience was the foundation of that's what a palace is all about, right? I mean, imagine a medieval palace. Everything's fine in the medieval palace. The people outside are all starving to death or dying from the plague, but inside the palace, they're playing music and there's a jester. So he decides he's got to go. And Kandaka, his horse, is saddled by Chana, his friend, the groom, kind of grew up with him in the palace as his servant, and they ride onward in the night, because of course he had to leave in the night, because Suddhodana would not have let him leave at a different time. And when they get to the border of Shakya, because Suddhodana is not the king of Magadha, the neighboring kingdom, that's when Siddhartha cuts his hair off. He has kind of a fancy dagger. He's cutting his... the dagger is like that long that he's cutting his hair off with. He cuts his hair. He gives Chana all his fancy, jewelry and everything. He had like a princely necklace thing. And says, go back to the palace. Tell my father I've left. And just walks with almost nothing. Just a sarong, essentially. Into Magadha, the neighboring kingdom. Now pause there for a moment. Imagine Chana, the groom, a servant in the palace, showing up back at the palace with all the prince's stuff and saying, oh, he's left. You'd probably be executed immediately, or at least, dungeon and, where'd he go? I think Channa had a lot of courage just to go back to the palace and tell everybody. Ultimately, he does go find the Buddha and study spiritual matters with him. So it works out. Did I mention the Buddha's son's name? I don't think I did. His son's name is Rahula. Nice name, starts with an R. What does Rahula mean? It means fetter. A fetter is a rope you tie around a goat's ankle to keep it from getting away. So essentially, Siddhartha had named his son, holds me back. So I'm just trying to say that even in the context of Yasodhara getting pregnant and all this stuff, Siddhartha was already kind of planning, thinking, knowing this was going to have to be the trajectory of his life. But this great renunciation, renouncing not just a little household, but renouncing being the king of a kingdom, that's why we call it the great renunciation, that's when the Buddha's life takes a big turn. I've been speaking for quite a while. I try to be animated in my speech, and there are pictures, but I know it's hard to just sit. And so let's pause for a moment. Do you have any questions about the first part of his life that we could interact about? Yes?
So is that in the upper right corner, God, did you say?
That's right. Yeah, you can tell because they have lots of faces, no legs, and they're floating up there.
So they're just like
Observing, yeah, no, because this is a wonderful thing. Having seen Siddhartha in his previous life in Tushita heaven, it's really exciting because so we believe there are these realms of birth. We can all be born as gods, or born as hell beings, or born as hungry ghosts, or humans, which is actually wonderful. Take advantage of it while you got it. The godly birth is not so great because it's so wonderful you don't really want to do anything. It's sort of like sitting on the couch your whole life. But they were observing and saw that just like the psychic seers, Asita and people like that, when the baby was born, that this was a momentous being and that they were going to change everything by their life. So they're often in these paintings painted by an artist in Sri Lanka. You'll see those observing. At the time of the Buddha's enlightenment, this occurs as well. So it's interesting because Buddhism, we call it non-theistic, which is not that we're atheistic. We don't say there are no gods. We just say the gods aren't an important part of the spiritual growth of human beings. Obviously, there are many countries, if you say that, you can get burned at the stake. So that's been a problem on and off. But it's a little bit of a softer view than atheistic. There's no such thing as that. Because atheism is often based in materialism, and now you kind of have a very, very narrow extreme. I had two extremes before. There's this extreme and this extreme. Atheism is certainly one of those extremes, and Buddhism is somewhere in the middle there. Okay, we should pause for a human comfort break. There's tea and some cookies and stuff there. The bathroom, there's 2 bathrooms down the hall, and we will reconvene in 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, thank you. This is the book. I can email a link to an electronic copy for you, or you could take one now and make some donation for it. It's the custom.
Okay, well, I don't have cash with me, so.
I'm sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Right, then you can use the PayPal. And you can still find us PayPal. 2.5 minutes? Yeah. Okay.
I had a similar question.
Yes.
About the book. Did you register for the class?
Did you get the acknowledgement of your registration message?
I did not check.
Okay.
I did not check. lose their life and go for it.
Maybe you want to have them do that.
Well, I would like to, but I also want to make sure that I'm honoring whatever the sort of agreement is, if that makes sense. Well, all fairness. Oh. Education.
Does it have a link to the ebook?
Thank you.
Okay.
So yeah, I'd like to purchase it, but you purchase it downstairs or? There you go. Thank you. I will.
Kind of a St. Francis type of Charlie complaints about me handing, why didn't you do that?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
it's a
of course.
short. Well, I have it on, she sent me it, I have it online, so I could do both. I mean, if you need it.
I don't need it. I'm gonna have a bale of them. So the people that make that, it's interesting, the BDK, the Buddhist Kokai or something like that, Society for the Propagation of Buddhism in Japan, is actually run or financed by the president of the Toyota Corporation, who recently died a few years ago, but still. And so they have a foundation that prints these books. They print those books in all the facts. I have copies of them. You can as a loan your copy. So they printed this book in French, Portuguese, Spanish, Indonesian, Nepali, German, Italian, Korean, Esperanto, Norwegian, Chinese, Simplified Chinese, Traditional, Finnish, Romanian, Polish, Persian, Vietnamese, Swedish, Tagalog, English, Serbo-Croatian, Hindi, Dutch, Turkish, Thai, Russian, Tibetan, Cambodian, Sinhalese, Arabic, Greek, Myanmarian, Urdu, Mongolian, Kyrgyz, which I think they speak in Kyrgyzstan, Swahili, I don't know what that is, Kazakh, Uzbek, Bengali, Malayan, Magyar, and Bulgarian. So they print them in all these different languages. There is a little bit of a snafu supply chain wise. We've been trying for 2 years now to get this top down. We distribute those to the prisons. Because prisoners aren't allowed to have contact with high-priced Marshall's life is very, very different. He went to study, well, I'll take you to that part, but he was a prince. Remember, something happened because that story of the palace, and this when he finishes his studies, is not well. It looks like a walking skeleton. What happened in between? He studied with six very intelligent teachers, including spiritual teachers, systems of meditation, metaphysics, psychic phenomenon, kind of stuff. And he studied a lot in what we would now call Buddhism, but they didn't call it back then. What we experience as Hinduism is the Hindu response to Buddhism, which is kind of like the difference between old Catholicism and the Lutheran Church downstream. So what we're experiencing as Hinduism now is the Lutheran Church downstream. Hinduism before was way, 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 way different. It just the most hideous part of Hinduism at that time was you had to build a temple with places for sacrifice, and then you had to have feathers for the blood to run because you sacrifice not to kill, so they didn't go all the blood. They would have to engineer, so that that aspect of Hinduism at the time made Buddha's search for the end of suffering. So everybody in those temples was thinking that, well, if we appease the god by sacrificing a goat, then maybe the god will smile upon us and plants grow in the field and make my business, trading business of goat skins work out and all this sort of stuff. Buddha didn't see it that way, and when he studied with highly may be a wee bit disappointing for the folks who are watching this recording because I had my mic off. Sorry. Okay, so the Buddha studied with these six important teachers, and he studied ancient Hindu methodologies. The most important thing that he studied, though, was techniques of meditation. And he learned with each one of these six teachers, he learned the system fantastically quickly. In a year, he learned everything the teacher had to teach. And at each juncture with these teachers, the teacher would say, you know, you're a wonderful student. Maybe when I retire, you could run my ashram because you're just a great student. And the Buddha would say, well, thank you very much, but I'm questing to understand why suffering occurs in sentient beings. And the system you have taught me, while interesting and useful as a method of insight and concentration, is not bringing me to that answer that I'm looking for. So then you go to the next teacher, sign up, go to class, year goes by, the teacher says, wow, you were such a fantastic student. Could you maybe take over for me and I could retire? And the Buddha says the same thing. Your system is interesting, but it didn't provide me with the answer. So the purport of all of those systems is that their explanation for suffering is that human beings are defiled in some way. They're dirty. So purification is the path to heaven, essentially. And the last piece, the reason the Buddha doesn't look very well, they said that, you know, anything you take into your body from the material world is making you impure. Well, this is a problem if you eat food or drink water. So the Buddha started just having like 1 grain of rice a week, because if eating a lot of food is bad, then eating a little tiny bit of food is less bad, I guess, was kind of the thing. And they thought that this would purify the person, who would be called a yogi. You've seen those cartoons where the yogis lie on beds of nails and stuff. Well, it's partly that idea, that system, that somehow by experiencing intense pain or going beyond intense pain, you're purifying your spirit. And once your spirit is completely purified, it can reunite with the big Brahman, big God energy, kind of a loose explanation of the goal in Hinduism. The Buddha studied in those systems, And then he went kind of off independent. He went with, well, I want to say 5 other students that had started to kind of follow him. As he would go from ashram to ashram, they went with him. They didn't really say they were following him, but, you know, if you go for a while and somebody's kind of hanging around behind you, you can figure out they're following you. Those pesky kids, right? So the last year of this period of, I would say, almost creative illness, he went off on his own. And he lived in the woods. He had almost no clothing. He just ate what the forest provided, but only in tiny, tiny amounts to avoid impurity. And he felt like he was on the brink of some kind of important something or other, but he was so weak. At one part of the story says he went to the river to wash, and he was too weak to get out. So this is a very dangerous condition. And basically, he's almost going to die. You can see there's a bowl of food here. So he didn't drown in the river. There's this part of the story is he has a wash basin, and he says, it's kind of like when he proclaimed himself as a baby. He says, if this wash basin goes upriver, my quest to find the end of suffering will occur. And the wash basin floats upriver. And he thinks, okay, I'm almost onto it. But maybe somebody helps him get out of the river, and he has the great realization that the extreme of indulgence that he grew up with in the palace was certainly not leading to spiritual awakening. The other way was just plastering over it with hedonistic pleasures. And then this other thing he tried was another crazy extreme. What if I meditate all the time and don't eat anything? Maybe then I will come to great spiritual realization to find the answer to why sentient beings suffer. So that didn't work, and this didn't work. So now he comes to the first piece of a realization of the middle way, that there has to be something in between there where you don't overdo it, but you sustain your body, and then you can think. Because really what was happening was he gets to the point of starvation where you can no longer think. And misunderstanding, just like misunderstanding hallucinations from chemically induced visions, we could call them visions, but they're just delusions, at the big complicated party in the palace, that's not valid. Those are just biochemical delusions that occur because of the weird chemicals you took in your body. It means nothing. By the same token, when you try to purify himself completely, there's a tradition, Native American culture of crying a vision. A big part of that is not eating and not drinking and sitting outside for 3 days. Well, it turns out that if you don't drink water for 3 days, you can die. So sure enough, you have all kinds of weird visions because your body is shutting down. But the Buddhist point of view is that is not a valid vision. The universe isn't talking to you. In that case, your body is just falling apart. And from the inside, it looks like a dream, a story, a vision. So that's where he realized that it had to be a middle way out of this. Sujata, the village girl, was out in the woods near Gaya, the town of Gaya, and sees this person. Maybe she actually had a plate of food for the forest god, and she wanted to get married. She wanted to find a good husband, so she was going to give a plate of food to the forest god and ask the forest god to help her find a good husband. So, and she runs into Siddhartha, who didn't look very human in his state, and so she said, would you like this food? And Siddhartha just come to that realization that he was starving himself to death, and that really he was on the brink of death, and he needed to eat the food. So, plate of food there. The 5 friends who'd been following Siddhartha around this whole time said, oh, wow, we thought Siddhartha was the real deal, but he chickened out. He gave up. He just ate some food. And they're kind of dismissive, and they're, you don't know what you're doing, and they take off. So now he's alone. He starts to eat food. Sujata comes back regularly with food, maybe by herself, or maybe some other village kids came along too. And then she realizes that that this is a religious seeker person. It is not the god of the forest. And she basically nurses him back to health with, they talk about rice porridge, which I think is milk and rice boiled together. So that seems like a good way to kind of get somebody back. You know, it's a simple kind of food. Okay, so the next exciting piece is enlightenment. So Siddhartha says, I've got all the pieces, feels as though he has all the pieces of the puzzle, and he needs to just concentrate in one place. He vows as he sits beneath a fig tree. It will later have an important name, but at that point it's just some fig tree sitting in the jungle. He says, I will sit under this tree until I solve this problem of suffering, until I reach enlightenment. Different versions say it in different ways. But basically he said, I'm not leaving this spot until I solve this problem. So he resolves in that way. Now, resolving to not eat anymore, it didn't work out that well for him. But each one of those decisions, kind of as causes and conditions go, has led him onward. So he sits under this tree. We usually have a Bodhi tree sitting right over there. There isn't enough sunlight in this room in the winter for it, so we have to move it on that side of the building where the sun shines in. It does drop all its leaves in February, March, which is worrisome to me, but they tend to come back, so it's a weird time for a tree to drop leaves. The Bodhi tree, the enlightenment tree, is the fig tree that the Buddha sits underneath. It's actually called Ficus religiosa in its Linnaean name. It's a Latin name for the kind of tree. So he sits under this tree, and just like under the rose apple tree, he uses his meditative capabilities, his spiritual energy to focus and works through the jhana states of meditation and bliss underneath this tree. Stories may vary, but 49 days later, there is the night of enlightenment that occurs. And there are 4 watches of the night. Let me see if I have, okay. So, oopsie. Yeah, okay. So, in the first part of that night of his enlightenment, the Buddha starts to see that he's not just a person right now, he's been a lot of people before, and he'll be other people later. So he kind of sees that idea of birth after birth after birth occurring. This could bring up lots of questions for us because, well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean actually like getting born over and over again? Or do you mean, I don't know if any of you experienced other periods of your life where you were a very different person. Has anybody experienced that? Right. So some people are very stable. Other people can, do some pretty crazy stuff and then come back from it and then have a pretty normal life and a wonderful life. Or vice versa can happen. You can have a wonderful organized life and it can all fall apart. And you become some different person that you don't really even recognize. So the Buddha saw, even across the expanse of time, that same kind of process of becoming and becoming and becoming. That's our nature. We're not one thing. We're changeful. That's why non-self, we say non-self as opposed to no-self. We have a self. It's something inside us that's kind of the center of who we are, our karmic consciousness. And it changes over time. We become different because of other causes and conditions flowing together. He saw that very clearly on that night of enlightenment. And he saw the causal connection, karma, the causes flowing together. Karma means actions, so how his actions and the actions of others flowed together to move him forward toward enlightenment. So Now comes the interesting part. You can see because of the dancing girls. Mara, the undoer, often referred to kind of like the devil in Buddhism, but you ever had that voice in your head say that you can't do it, you're not good enough? Some people hear that voice sometimes. And it doesn't have to be speaking, and you don't have to see an apparition, to just have a sense that sometimes we have a lack of confidence about things, and sometimes it's almost like an organized attack on whatever you're trying to do. So in this case, Mara, the undoer, realizes that if Mara is sort of this devilish figure that feeds off of the suffering of sentient beings, and one sentient being is about to reach enlightenment, which could result in a chain reaction, because once they teach other sentient beings how not to suffer, then they won't suffer. And if Mara's food supply is suffering, that suffering will decrease, and wonderful joy will increase, and that is bad news for Mara. Okay, so Mara watched that first part of the Night of Enlightenment and sent kind of an army of ghouls to maybe stop Siddhartha from moving toward enlightenment that night. The army of ghouls shoots spears and arrows, and Siddhartha puts his hand up like this, and all the spears and arrows turn into flowers. Okay, that worked out well, but took a fantastic amount of kind of energy of manifestation. So then Mara says, well, I know what I'll do. I'll send my 3 sexy daughters, Raga, Moha, and Dosa, which are like rage, lust, and something else, his 3 daughters, to do a sexy dance and distract them. Because the guy's been sitting under a tree for 49 days. It seems like it won't take much to distract him. So they come up and they do the dance, and it doesn't sway Siddhartha. He can see through the trick there. Oh, it's the old distract him with sensuality trick. And he shrugs it off, so that's good. Then Mara sends a giant storm, and this cobra, which represents the earth, it also represents the ancient religions of India, because they're from the earth, and the snake and the river are the same thing in ancient Indian mythology. So a giant cobra is a representative of that, comes and protects Siddhartha. So even in this raging storm, the earth comes to protect Siddhartha. So the gods are watching from a distance. The earth itself is involved in this process. So it's a giant cosmic, not cataclysm, but wonderful occurrence. The last bit, I don't have a slide for this, but the last bit of the Night of Enlightenment, Mara, it's kind of what do you call it, like a trial kind of a thing, adversarial argumentation. Mara thinks he can just talk the Buddha out of being enlightened, and Mara's clever, and if you ever listen to these voices in your head, you can hear them, because they're just as smart as you, so it's not really, maybe it's a fair fight, but maybe it's certainly, it's hard to get the upper hand over those voices with argumentation, because they can always counter you, because they know what you're thinking, right? So that's what Mara does. Really, Siddhartha, I should be the one who's enlightened, because really, I know more about all being suffering than anybody. I eat suffering for a living, or maybe propagate it, but I'm not sure which. Siddhartha doesn't really respond with logical argument. Siddhartha touches the earth, and enlightenment occurs. So, mythically, we can kind of unpack what does that really mean. On some level, in Shin Buddhism, we feel as though all that time Siddhartha was trying to get enlightenment, in that one moment, he just accepts enlightenment. So he even lets go of wanting enlightenment. He doesn't fight his way heroically through. There was a heroic fighting part. But in that last moment before enlightenment, he's just accepting, deeply hearing the wise, compassionate energy of the universe, which is actually Amida Buddha, manifest in the universe around him, and enlightenment occurs. So this is an enlightenment occurs picture.
And so we'll turn
There's no escape from the wheel of life. There's no escape from suffering. Listen to me, Siddhartha. I am Mara, Lord of Hell. I know what I'm talking about. But I've got to admire your determination. You've been sitting there for weeks, hoping that a solution to life's problems will drop into your lap like a ripe fig. Give up now and save yourself the effort. Wiser men than you have tried and failed to find an answer. And you will fail too, Siddhartha. And so the wheel turns. And yet it all looked so promising at the start. Born on the full moon of May, Prince Siddhartha Gautama. Asita the seer prophesied that you would grow up to be a great leader, either a king or a holy man. Of course, your father wanted you to be a king and reign after his death, not become some wandering fortune teller. So he decreed that you should live in luxury and never see the world of pain outside the palace, and so never see the need for religion. And so the wheel turns. Silk and honeysuckle, sarangis and spice. Every sense was sated, but you still weren't satisfied. All you could do is ask questions. What is life? Why are we here? Is this all there is? And then one day, you asked, what lies beyond the palace walls? For the first time, you went out into the city, riding in a gilded carriage. But you wanted to see the city by yourself, so you escaped into the maze of alleyways. And you were horrified by what you saw. An old woman, wrinkled, toothless and crooked. A man eaten up by disease, coughing, sweating and covered in boils. Then, by the banks of a river, a funeral procession. The dead body was carried to the water's edge and laid gently on a pile of wood. The family trailed behind, crying and wailing in their grief. You stayed until the pile was lit and watched as oily black smoke billowed to the sky. It was the end of your innocence. There is no point to life. All that happens is that you get old, get ill, and die. But on the way back to the palace, a holy man was sitting serenely at the side of the road, begging for alms. He had nothing, but he seemed at peace. Here, you thought, must be the answer. And so the wheel turns. You left the palace in the dead of night and rode to the far reaches of the kingdom. You exchanged your robes for rags, and in a forest you found a group of 5 holy men. They were naked and dirty, unkempt and scrawny. They said that by making their bodies suffer, their spirits could be free. So you joined them and starved yourself until you were nothing but skull and sinew, yet still there were no answers. And so the wheel turns. A young woman came to give an offering to the forest gods and thought she found a tree spirit. You took her food and ate your fill. You gave up a life of comfort and you gave up a life of suffering. But neither pleasure nor pain will give you the answer. And so the wheel turns through birth, youth, and to this moment. It will turn on through old age, illness, and death. It will turn on through all your lives beyond, over and over again, in a never-ending and meaningless cycle. And you will learn nothing. Experience will not give you the answer. So how long are you going to sit here? It's been 49 days. It's full moon again and the morning star is rising once more. What's this? A new idea forming? What's this fleeting thought I cannot grasp? It's there on the edge of your consciousness, but getting closer. Show me. A middle way? What's that? You say life can never satisfy us because we always want more. You say the only way to achieve peace is to stop wanting. You say the answer is to sit at the centre of a wheel, detached from the world that revolves around you. Only then can a person achieve peace. Brave words, Siddhartha, but they are wasted. There is no one here to behold your enlightenment. No, the earth itself is his witness. She conspires with Siddhartha to reject me. He has awoken. He is enlightened. He is the Buddha.
Well, that's a nice video. It kind of goes over everything I said before in simpler form, so that's helpful and useful. Somebody in some How to Teach Things class said that if you say the same things in different ways and different presentation methods, then people recognize and learn stuff. So I have included that. I don't understand what happened to my sequence. Oh no. Oh no, the robot has taken control. Oh, okay, I'll do it the easy way. So, we've reached the point where the Buddha was enlightened. Here. And that's a big deal. And after he was in... Did that happen before? Like that same zooming kind of phenomenon? I will attempt. Yeah, that's true. It may be just jumping to the next chapter of these things. Oh, it's going to be harder for me. There's Mara's daughters. Okay. So, after the Buddha was enlightened, one of those gods that had been observing came down and had a chat with the Buddha. And one of the things the god said was, "This is wonderful. You have actually gone beyond suffering. You've reached a sustained, joyful way of being. So for all sentient beings, your example will be extremely valuable. To be the first one who does something is..." Nothing's changed, right? Okay. To be the first one who's done something is very difficult and requires a whole, vast lifetime after lifetime of experience to really get to. But now that you have reached that point, you can teach other people kind of the shortcut way. And that's true with all kinds of things. That's really how civilization and education and understanding rolls onward. So, the god says this to the Buddha, and the Buddha says, "Yeah, I don't know. People aren't going to understand. And then they're going to get confused. And then I'll try to explain it. And then I'll get frustrated. I don't know if I really want to get into such a big deal." And this is true. Many beings are enlightened, and they're just enlightened. Maybe they work at the donut shop. You know, that person who's just really wonderful, and they seem really nice. And you feel warm and good around them. And if you ask them a question, they have a real wise answer. But that's as far as it goes. They're content and happy to just be enlightened without going to the trouble of trying to teach everybody in a whole world system these insights. So the Buddha, at that point, okay, so Siddhartha will call him the Buddha. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. So the Buddha has this interchange with Indra, king of the gods, and sees both sides, the pros and cons, but ultimately concludes that it will be of value to teach. So he wanders off from that place, which is now called Bodh Gaya, because Bodhi is enlightenment, and Gaya was the name of the town, so Bodh Gaya is the Gaya, the town where the Buddha was enlightened. My friend, who's a priest that lives there, calls it Buddha Gaya, which I think he's trying to speak English. I get it. It's nice. It's sweet. They keep inviting us back, and through this whole pandemic thing, it's just been crazy. So they've made it through. Bodhgaya is fine now, but there were some difficult times, and a lot of senior teachers died. Anyway, so he walked to Sarnath, a neighboring place, a deer park, essentially, for that's the description they call it, the deer park in Sarnath. And he finds his 5 friends. And the 5 friends that had a month or 49 days plus some time, okay, let's say 3 months before, had said, oh, Siddhartha gave up. Now they look at him and they say, oh, here comes that Siddhartha, the loser. We're not even going to look at him. We won't even acknowledge him. And he walks up and they think, wait a second, there's something different about him. And they ask him, what's so different about you? And he said, I'm awake. And they recognized that is what they were all looking for this whole 7 years of study and search. And so this is the first time the Buddha teaches. And he teaches the 4 Noble Truths, that life can be joyful, but we don't experience it that way, that there's the cause of our not having a joyful life is this clinging and wanting experience, that if you take away that clinging and wanting, joy just naturally flows into us, and then the way to do that has kind of 8 aspects, the Eightfold Path. So he teaches them, does a Dharma talk on that there in Sarnath. And as is always the way with those Buddha Sutra stories, a few of the people listening to him are enlightened as well in that moment. Dr. Matsunaga used to joke that he has done hundreds and hundreds of Dharma talks, and he's never seen any of the people in the audience go poof and get enlightened. But oh well. So this is the beginning of what we call the Sangha, the community of Buddhist folks who are pursuing this idea. And so you can see the Buddha is teaching. So the first Noble Truth is this, the second Noble Truth is this, the third Noble Truth is that, and the fourth Noble Truth is that, because that's the way you count in India. If you want to buy 12 eggs in the market, you count each third 3 times for each of the 4 fingers, and you count with your thumb. It's kind of confusing, because I thought base 10, right? Everybody told us the reason we have base 10 numbers is we have 10 fingers, but it turns out that's just a cultural thing, and this may be the reason a dozen is an important number, because it's the same number as 12. Anyway, so the 12-step chain of causation, if you see a statue of the Buddha like this, you could figure out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The 8th step of the 8, well, maybe the last step of the Eightfold Path was more likely this. That's what the Buddha, this mudra, which means the gestural position of the Buddha's hand in this case, it represents a number. And because they didn't have writing back then, everybody had to remember stuff in lists. So the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and the 12-step chain of causation are all these number lists that help us get the framework of what Buddhism is about. So he's teaching there, and he's teaching the 4 Noble Truths to his friends. Okay, is this going to jump, or maybe I must have bumped the button or something when I was holding it. Okay. So at this point, he's 39, at the point of enlightenment, he's got 40 more years of teaching that occur. And it starts out just kind of wandering teaching, and then it becomes more institutionalized, because you get to have, when you have 10,000 students, you're pretty much going to have a university of some kind. You have to have buildings, you'll have to have food, you'll have to have systems for all these things. And even though the Buddha seemed to eschew the idea of being, running a system, he recognized the compassionate value of people learning the Dharma. So he kind of, he delegated quite a bit of that effort to people. And then rich folks, lay folk who had means would give gifts to this group. So they came to a town, then some rich person would give them this mango grove. You can stay in this mango grove as long as you need it. And it becomes a place where there's a monastery. Even now, some of those places are still very, very old monastery sites. So the Buddha would teach, and then he taught to the point where his students could teach the same system. So he had wonderful close students that were sort of his inner circle, and they would have retreats. He has a very important retreat on Vulture Peak in Magadha in the Old Kingdom, and he would take time out from the organizational and the teaching part of it, but go back and forth. And he taught many, many different important sutras. We say there's 84,000 sutras, so those are all the Dharma talks of the Buddha compiled into the what was now our volumes, but in the old days people had to remember all of those, which was a challenge. When he would go from place to place, they decided that the best method would be we'll have Ananda, an attendant, another student. I use the word student instead of monk because monk kind of implies a lot of stuff that we don't really have in our culture, so student makes sense. But the committed students obviously have given everything up. They don't live at home anymore. They just wear robes. They have a bowl. They go out. If they want to eat that day, they go out and stand in front of people's houses. If the people come out and give them food, then they eat that day. That's a lot of the monastic system of Buddhism of the time. So he eventually went back to Kapilavastu, I think before his father died, and when he went there, a lot of other Shakya people gave up, renounced their lives as they were to study with Shakyamuni, with a sage of the Shakya people, and so Buddhism really starts as an ism, as an institution in the world about 2,600 years ago. In his life, so Ananda was also his cousin. He grew up with him in the palace in Kapilavastu, but Ananda becomes a student of the Buddha in earnest. Had a photographic memory, which is very important, because all of the sutras, Ananda was so they decided, the community through consensus is kind of how things were decided in those days. Ananda would go with the Buddha wherever he would go. If he would go to some fancy person's house and they would put on a feast and the Buddha would teach, Ananda would go and come back to the monastery and tell everybody, just recite what the Buddha had taught. And then they would go on a long walk from this important city to another important city in the neighboring kingdom. 2 weeks they would walk. Well, as they walked along, there would be interactions with farmer or with fisher folk or maybe one of the students. Often, people from other religious schools would kind of try to stump the Buddha. And usually in those sutras, what always happens is the Buddha converts the person who was sent to trick him, to stump him. So, of course, those are Buddhist sutras, and I don't know, in the Jain religion, there may be a corresponding sutra. At the time we sent the guy to stump the Buddha, and he succeeded. I don't know. They're not really antagonistic, but a wee bit there was some antagonism going on. It was not easy going through all of this. This actually represents when he went back to, this particular slide represents when he went back to Kapilavastu. His stepmother said, well, Pajpati was her name. Mahapajpati is the respectful way to say the great Pajpati. Was actually his mother's sister. So if you have to have a stepmother, that's wonderful to have your mother's sister be. And then you think, well, wait a second, was she also married to Suddhodana? Well, he's a king, so he probably had several wives. Anyway, both sisters. So that's his, though not his birth mother, his nurturing mother. Pajpati says, well, I see all your students are men, and what's up with that? And the Buddha says, I'm not really going to talk about that right now. He just wanders off. She asks him again, and he says, well, I'm going to have to, he ignores her, and I'm going to have to leave Kapilavastu, have to go back to Magadha. So the burning question of 50% of humanity was brought up, but didn't really go anywhere. So they get together and walk back to some other town. I can't remember which city they walked to, 2 weeks. And Ananda knew Pajpati too, because he grew up in the palace. He was a cousin of the Buddha, and says to the Buddha, well, what about Pajpati's question? Is there anything about women that makes it so this whole process of enlightenment and everything can't happen? And the Buddha said, no, nothing. I mean, all human beings are capable, all sentient beings are capable of enlightenment. And Ananda kind of continues to, as they're walking 2 weeks, you can bring up the same question in a pleasant way and kind of get a little more understanding, or maybe you politicking a little bit. Let's say, well, shouldn't you reconsider? The Buddha mentions that since everything is very patriarchal in that part of India at that time, that the idea of teaching women would be a big, complicated problem. So, kind of, don't talk to me anymore about that, Ananda. They walk some more. At this point, Pajapati thinks about it. She shaves her head, gets some orange robes, throws away her shoes, and starts walking, following the Buddha, which is kind of an interesting, assertive method, but strangely passively aggressive, because, you know, if you want to become a firefighter and you just get a firefighter uniform and put it on, and then go over to the fire station and say, well, what about it? It seems like things are a little bit out of whack, but okay. So, I mean, she's obviously much older than Siddhartha, and having had the life experience that she had, and living in the palace and everything, and seeing him grow up, and then seeing him teach, she really feels drawn to that. And she's about to be enlightened herself, and she's, well, 50 other women in Kapilavastu say, do you see what Pajapati's doing? Here we go. Cut their hair. They're giving up too. When I say giving up, they're renouncing regular material worldly life for the spiritual life, a pathway not available to women previously. So eventually, I know it's a long story, but it's a guy's whole life, so I wanted to bring up some important parts. They get to wherever they're going, and Ananda meets with Pajapati and sees what she's done, and her feet are just torn to ribbons because she's been basically the queen of a country, and now she just walked barefoot for 2 weeks. She's all dirty and everything, and he's never seen her like that. But what he really sees in that is the resolve that she's going to keep asking the Buddha this question, basically until he says yes, but until he sees what is right. And Ananda brings that up and comes to the Buddha and says, do you know Pajapati has followed us? She's taken robes. She's bringing a group of other Shakya women with her who are all interested in the spiritual life. What will you do? He says, well, okay, I'll listen to her. And so they have a meeting, and she talks about why she thinks everyone should be able to study Buddhism, and it shouldn't be just for men, or I mean, it shouldn't just be for men, it should be for everyone. So the Buddha says, well, I see your point, but culturally this isn't, you know, I'm paraphrasing it. Culturally this isn't going to work. We're in northern India 2,600 years ago. Are you kidding? You know, they'll just burn us at the stake. So they leave. Try one more time, and then the Buddha says, okay, I can see that you're going to be persistent about this, so I will start a lineage of nuns, female students, and and I think the whole time through this whole 2-week sojourn, he was thinking about it and trying to figure out how this could really work, because, you know, it's a gigantic shift in a culture, and he wanted it to be successful. So the old word for male student is bhikkhu, and then the female student is a bhikkhuni, so just like Spanish, you know, there's 2 words for everything. So he establishes the line of bhikkhunis. At that point, Pajapati becomes the leader person in the nunneries, but we just call them monasteries for whatever reason. And the only really kind of caveat, a lot of feminists get really angry at Buddhism because, gee whiz, you know, you didn't make it equal. It's like, well, wait a second. It's 2,600 years ago, and we had an entire, you know, paradigm shift to include women in the process of spiritual life. And just because the Buddha added 260 extra rules that do a lot have to do with hygiene and clothing and when you can go take a bath and when you can't and all this kind of stuff, which seems mildly discriminatory, but that's it. That's the only real difference. And deep down, the point is that the Buddha opened Buddhism to all people, men or women, didn't matter. Yes, they were separated because the wanting feeling occurs when men and women are together in a certain way that if you separate them, it happens less. So they did that. They did come together at times for Dharma talks to listen to the Buddha, and then, you know, there were a lot of rules. One of the rules was every nunnery has to have a male priest who's responsible for the whole thing. So okay, I mean, it was a gigantic leap forward with a few little kind of, now in retrospect you could ask questions about it. It was a wonderful thing, but only because Pashupati was essentially his mother and said, look, this is important. Why are you leaving all these people behind? He opened Buddhism to all. So that's what this is about. This is the initial time when they're meeting Kapilavastu and probably the ideas dawning on Pashupati. So things continue. This is a picture of the ordination of Rahula. Remember Rahula, the Buddha's son? 9 years old. He gets to join his father, but it's not really his father anymore. He's the Buddha. So you don't think of those family relationships once someone is enlightened, and they're kind of connected to everyone. But Rahula becomes a student and gets a certain amount of interest in teachers. There's no sense that Rahula will be the next Buddha when the Buddha dies or anything like that, because it's a very communal kind of studying, learning culture. They just eat meals in the morning, maybe a breakfast or a big lunch, and then no more food the rest of the day, which is kind of a interesting middle way-ish approach. If you get into eating all the time, then you're just satisfying that wanting, that thirst. So there's a whole half the day they studied well into the night. They would sit and meditate, or there would be Dharma talks for years. And the Buddha traveled around northern India on foot the whole time, never rode a horse, never rode in a carriage. It was kind of an important rule. So, we're almost there. The story of the Buddha's life does have to kind of end, but kind of not end. Thich Nhat Hanh made the famous comment in one of his books that, you know, when is a cloud born and when does a cloud die? That's the way you should think about me when I die. It's not different. The cloud isn't really gone, it's just different. It may be rain, or may have gone into water vapor in the sky that you can't see, but it's there. So, the Buddha's story of the Buddha's death. It's the last one of these stories I will tell you for today. He went to a home, so they're traveling all over northern India, sending other teachers, he's teaching teachers to go out and communicate the Dharma with folks. And important kings and stuff like that are converting to Buddhism. They become Buddhist kingdoms, important Buddhist kingdoms. King Bimbisara of Magadha is the most important friend, who's also a king, so was a great patron of the Buddha. All that goes on. But 80 years old, goes to the blacksmith's house. They're going from one place to another, and the blacksmith offers a meal, so the Buddha says, okay, let's sit down and we'll have the meal. And the Buddha takes a couple bites of the food. In those days, fairly common in Asia now, that the most important person is the first person to eat at a big dinner, and then after that, then the other people can eat. Okay, so he takes a few bites, and he takes the dish and hands it to the blacksmith and says, bury this. Don't even feed it to a dog. There's something wrong with it. So, but the Buddha's eaten it. And it's a mushroom and pork dish. Thinking back 2,600 years, what could possibly be wrong with mushroom and pork, right? The worst thing would be you picked poisonous mushrooms and the pork is bad, trichinosis and all the nasty things that grow in old pig meat. It's sad and ignominious and whatever, but they move onward from the blacksmith's house. The Buddha walks for a while, and the pain is too much in his stomach. So he has terrible dysentery, stops at the side of the road. They try to go on another day, but he's too ill to keep going. He sits down between two sal trees by the side of the road, and tells Ananda that he's not going to live any longer than that. Now, at 80 years old, 2,600 years ago, almost everyone he knew had died already. So he was old. Many of his students had already died. So it was kind of, well, it was almost like a second lifetime, really, the extra 40 years. And he's ill. He tells Ananda that this is it. I'm going to die. And, you know, bring whoever you can to this place. And so he teaches one last time. So there's the Mahaparinibbana Sutra, the great and complete nirvana. That's when the Buddha died. Sutra. He teaches. Somebody comes, like the last person to be enlightened from direct contact with the Buddha. This guy comes and asks the Buddha some question. He says, I've heard about your teaching. What about this? And the Buddha goes on into a nice, wonderful Dharma talk. And then he's too ill to continue. So between two sal trees, so we always, the rose apple tree, the Bodhi tree, and the sal trees are all kind of sacred trees in Buddhism. He lies down. You can see how he's lying with his hand on underneath his head. There's some Buddha statues where the Buddha is leaning on an arm, and that's just reclining, it's just relaxing. If the Buddha's head is on a pillow or on his hand, this is a statue of the Buddha's death. I don't know, you can't see that one because we have a bright light, but the hand is very important. So that tells you it's not a reclining Buddha, it is the Mahaparinibbana, it's the death of the Buddha. So he teaches everything. The last thing he says, behold, O students, this advice to you, all component things, all compound things, all conditioned things in the world change. They are not lasting. Work hard to gain your own salvation. That's sort of the last thing the Buddha says. And then he dies. So it's really sad to have a wonderful teacher die of dysentery by the side of the road. And for one of the great religions of humans on the planet, for it to end in that way, you know, you kind of want, how did Muhammad go? He was riding a steed up to heaven, you know, in Jerusalem. That sounds pretty grand and everything. And Jesus, pretty painful, but there was sort of a grandness to all that. And then they buried him, and then he came out of the burial thing, and that's all amazing and fantastic. So as a Buddhist, I'm a little disappointed because old guy, 80 years old, walking from one town to another, eats some bad food and dies by the side of the road. And yet, I also feel like I can believe these people because they're telling me the truth. They're telling me it's not a gigantic, whereas his birth is often a very fanciful, mythic kind of description. Buddha's death is very clear, very realistic. I don't know why does that feel persuasive to me? I'm not sure, but it feels very persuasive. Like people who are willing to be this honest about the death of their great teacher are probably being honest about a lot of things. And so my sense of skepticism falls away in that moment. So that is the sad ending of the Buddha. And that was the whole Buddha's life. And thank you for your attention. Any questions vis-a-vis the life of the Buddha?
Well, I think it shows that he was a great person, but he was also human, which
Mm-hmm.
means that we can strive for that. We are human. We
Mm-hmm.
can also strive for that. One of the parables was the drunken man that had the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And is it the idea that you have that
Right. We all have Buddha nature. So even though in the actual Buddha's life, he dies, his mortality is real, just like our mortality is real, he actualized that Buddha nature to be awake, but we all have that. And so that ignominious death also reminds us that we have everything we need to do that. Dalai Lama made the famous comment, you have everything you need to be happy. If you think about that and you contemplate that deeply, the first answer we usually come to, yes, but. If I just had the Tesla, then I would be happy. If I just had the new wife, then I'd be happy. If I had a new iPhone, then I'd be happy. There's so many of these weird things we think we need, and for us to be happy, we would need that. And the truth is different from that. The truth is we have everything we need to be joyful right now. It's just have to have that turning, have to start letting go. The Eightfold Path is the methodology the Buddha taught to get to that place. But, and everybody will get there at their place and their time when the causes and conditions flow together. And Buddhas and Bodhisattvas try to encourage that to happen. They have great compassion. So they would put effort into saving us, essentially. That sounds a little kooky, like Christianity. Save me, I'm saved. Well, let's face it. Usually when you fall in the water, it's hard to get out if somebody else doesn't offer you a hand. And even the offering of the hand may just be teaching this stuff. That's a great offer. And that's a great kind of salvation. Without it, you know, where are we? Without a coherent, understandable, possible path forward, then we feel lost. Like in the little video thing. There was a moment of kind of the depth of difficulty where Siddhartha thinks, oh, okay, so you just go through all this suffering stuff and then you die. Great. What's the point? Well, there's more to it than that. And that's what the Buddha is teaching us and showing us. So, okay. I think we're about to the end of our appointed time together. The last thing I want to mention is the book. Let me borrow your book from you. Very kind of you to be sharing your book. So this time we will read the part about, okay, so it's essentially the first section from 2 to 32. I think that's what I have written on my plan. Yes, okay. And that goes over what we've talked about and talks about the Buddha's life. So if you would, just pick something that seems interesting or intriguing there and stick a Post-it on it, and a few of you we can share with the group next time. Next time will be our last class in this Buddhism 101 series. Then we have another class after that, the Shin Buddhism class. So any questions about the Buddha's life? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your kind attention.